Many years ago, at a church I served, there were some members, mostly progressive-minded women, who formed a group for study and fellowship. They told me they decided to call their group the Shoats, S-H-O-A-T-S. I said, "What's a shoat?" And they explained a shoat was a cross between a sheep and a goat. It was a reference to Matthew chapter 25, which Mark read for us earlier, where Jesus tells his followers to imagine a time in the future where two groups would be distinguished based on their behavior. The sheep were the ones who were living right, and the goats, they were the ones who were straying off the path, not exactly living up to expectations. So this group, by calling themselves the Shoats, they were acknowledging that they thought of themselves as proper Christians, but they still liked to have their fun. In fact, they took an annual long weekend to go to Las Vegas every year, and when I asked them about it, they would only laugh and tell me, the less you know, David, the better. As a minister, I have never been into moralizing. I am not a fan of dividing people into neat and tidy categories, and neither were the Shoats. They understood and they demonstrated that humans are complex creatures. Now, I do think there's a difference between right and wrong, but I also know we are far too quick to judge others and come up with convenient reasons to condemn people who might make us feel uncomfortable. So I really don't care what you do in Vegas, as long as no one gets hurt. And I honestly believe Jesus didn't care all that much about, doesn't care all that much about what you do in Vegas either, although I think he would find the very concept of Vegas rather nauseating. But what I mean is, I don't think Jesus was into moralizing, at least not in the way many of us might think. If you look at the record, he often partied with people who were regarded in the day as horrible reprobates by the upstanding, scolding religious types. And Jesus wasn't interested in dividing people into groups of bad people and good people either, in spite of how a passage like Matthew 25 has been interpreted over the years. What the Shoats got wrong was a pretty common misconception about that story of the sheep and the goats, that it's about judging sinners and saints. It's about who's going to go to heaven and who goes to the bad place. It's not about that. Even so, it's one of those stories in the Bible that has been misused for a very long time to bludgeon people over the head or to frighten them with hellfire and damnation if you do scandalous things like dancing and going to drive-in movies, when it has nothing at all to do with that. But the message we've heard about this over the years has been, you've got to be one way, like the sheep, pure and unsullied by the wicked ways of the world. Only people like that will ever be allowed into the kingdom of heaven. Can I get an amen? But if you're a goat, tisk, tisk, shame, shame, I know your name. There's no way you're getting in. God's been keeping track. And if you're on that list of goats, you are so doomed to doing the backstroke in the lake of fire for eternity with all those other horrible backsliders from history. That overly simplistic interpretation of what Jesus means when he speaks allegorically about sheep and goats is one of the biggest contributing factors to why so many people view Christianity as being completely out of step with reality. That's why plenty of perfectly great folks don't want to have anything to do with us. Their perception of Christianity is we've apparently divided the human race into absolute good people and absolute bad people. And, well, conveniently enough for us, because we believe certain things and say all the right words, we are always on the good side. We're the sheep. Everyone else is a goat. How obnoxious is that? Now, if you're a longtime churchgoer, you might think I'm either way off base here or maybe being too dramatic, or both. But broadly speaking, that perception, as incorrect as it may be, that perception is very real. That Christians think of ourselves as the exclusive owners of the truth, and that anyone who dares to have a different belief is morally bankrupt. I get that all the time when people find out I'm a minister. In not so many words, the assumption is that I'm the captain of the morality squad, which would be a huge shock to anyone I went to high school with. But the old idea that people are divided into categories of good or bad based on their religious beliefs, that even spills over into our civic life. It was impossible to avoid seeing those comparisons made during the election. We have weaponized words like conservative and liberal. A word like patriot has even been appropriated and politicized. I lost count of how many messages I saw presuming to tell me how a real Christian would cast their vote. We have so many code words and phrases to define and to divide people in simplistic, black and white, polarizing ways. We have all these loaded terms that we use to dehumanize and to sow division. And the great irony of all this team building, whether it's political or religious, is that any group that claims to own absolute knowledge or absolute beliefs, if they do achieve absolute power, that group is destined to fail. History tells us that if any group in power becomes more and more entrenched and invested in maintaining the purity of their doctrine, they end up self-destructing. That has been true in the long history of Christianity, and it's been true in the long history of politics, which is to say, it's been true in the long history of, well, history. But we just can't seem to help ourselves or learn from our mistakes. It's natural for us to align ourselves with like-minded people because we're social creatures and we all crave belonging and structure and stability. And it's a cheap and easy method to build and unify any group of people by comparing and contrasting yourselves to another group of people and then proclaiming they are wrong and inferior, so we must be right and superior. They are the enemy, and we must be united against them. They threaten us. That's the politics and that's the religion of fear. Sadly, fear works like a charm. If you're having some problems, just paint the others, the goats, as the cause of your problems. And that is a winning strategy every time, at least in the short term. But we know there is another way to build and to unify, and that is called hope. Problem is, hope is always a more difficult path to follow because it does not rely on our most basic fight or flight instincts that fear taps into. Hope requires looking beyond our self-interest, going against our hard wiring to look out for ourselves first. I've read a lot about the psychology behind our response to the climate crisis. Now, a lot of smart people have wondered why so many folks refuse to believe that the climate crisis is real. The problem, according to some, is that the facts of climate change, well, they simply haven't been communicated well and marketed correctly. And if you think about it, climate scientists have spoken a lot about this in large and impersonal terms, about the national or the global implications, about how it affects others. But what should be done to get through to people, they say, is to personalize this. Here's how climate change will affect you personally. Instead of global warming, we should call it climate cancer. They argue that people's attitudes and behavior will change only by appealing to their self-interest. Now that might sound like a rather cynical commentary on human nature. And although I think there may be some truth to that, I can think also of plenty of examples when people have been united in a common cause, even when it meant placing their self-interest aside. For instance, those who worked and marched for civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, they put their very lives on the line. They demonstrated the power of hope over fear. Now, most would say, and I would agree completely, that their cause was and still is a righteous one. And we should never forget that that movement was organized and energized and mobilized by the church. Black churches overwhelmingly, but plenty of white churches too, form the moral support system for people to seek unity and believe in hope, to envision a world where people are not divided into us and them, a world not defined by the color of one's skin, but a world where all are afforded dignity and accepted and respected and loved. So, let's get back to that passage where Jesus talks about sheep and goats. It's so important to really listen to how he describes each of those groups. First of all, they're not being distinguished by what they believe. So this is not about religion. They're not different races, nor ethnicities, nor nationalities. They're not defined by politics. They're not liberals. They're not conservatives. Sheep and goats don't fit any of the ways that we like to categorize people into teams. It's a distinction of behavior, not belief. Goats are simply those who ignore the needs of others. Goats see others as them and not us. Goats don't recognize the divine in those who are different. Goats are motivated by self-interest and fear. But sheep? Sheep are the ones who feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, tend to the sick, and visit the imprisoned. Sheep look beyond their self-interest. They understand that Christ is in every person. They are motivated by hope. So the big, weird irony of this story is how it has been used over the years by church people to divide folks between insiders and outsiders, between true believers and heretics, when it's truly not about believing in anything except taking care of others, loving your neighbor as yourself. And it's not about who gets into heaven and who doesn't. Jesus is no judge here in this story. It is the behavior of the sheep and the goats that determines their own fate. The kingdom of heaven is a self-fulfilling destiny. When you behave like a self-serving goat, sure, your life's going to feel more like a kind of hell, where you go around believing that other people who are not just like you are your mortal enemies to be feared and deserving of your scorn. Is that any kind of way to live? Jesus doesn't think so. On the other hand, sheep go through life understanding that giving yourself away in loving service to others and seeing others not as enemies to be feared, but friends to be valued and loved, because we're all on one human team and we need each other. That's heaven. That's living an eternal kind of existence. But let's be honest, it takes a lot more work to be a sheep than to be a goat. It takes courage and giving yourself away for a cause and for the sake of others. But sheep are what we need and what the world needs right now. There will always still be plenty of fearful goats out there, but our job is not to see ourselves as saints and them as sinners, or any other name that translates into us versus them. Our job and our calling is simply to keep on serving and keep on hoping, because self-giving wins out over selfishness, and hope overcomes fear, and love conquers hate every single time.